in the meantime, let me bring Professor Herman here. Herman, the first question was, you've heard the views expressed already by Professor Amin on this question, whether a newly formed state like Ambazonia can successfully develop without and industrialize without having its own independent currency. Professor Amin said emphatically no. And he was on the path of actually going deeper and deeper into what happened, what went wrong with the CFA arrangement, if at all it even started right. We are assuming it started right, and all what that went wrong with it. But I believe that this panel, this particular conversation is focused on Ambazonia. So maybe, Herman, if you don't have much, if you prefer to go to the second question, I will be fine with that. What are the main challenges that the soon-to-be Ambazonian state faces in developing its own independent currency?
Thank you very much, Prof. I think I will combine both because they have some similar themes that go together. Clearly, you cannot be independent if you don't control your monetary system. And in thinking about that, something that I think it is very important that we draw a distinction between what's matter. The CFA is not a currency. I think it's a misconception we keep saying. The franc CFA is a legal tender. It is not a currency. And if I have time later, I can go into the details of the difference. Ambazonia cannot develop if it just gets another legal tender. A legal tender is just any money or note that you can exchange for goods, not different from trading by barter. You lose all the instruments of a monetary system. Now, what do you as Ambazonia, what do we need to do, things we can discuss publicly to be able to successfully set up our own system, all right? The first that goes underneath any monetary system is trust. We have to build trust, internal trust, external trust. Because at the end of the day, people are going to walk around with pieces of paper based on the trust that that paper will be exchanged for something of value. And this goes back to the question Mangang was asking online regarding inflation. Inflation is one of the greatest destroyers of value, right? I have to be sure that 1,000 amber or 1,000 cowries or whatever the denomination, or $1,000 I received today buys me approximately the same thing a month from now or a year from now. Otherwise, I cannot negotiate my pay because it may not be able to pay my rent or feed my family 2 months from now if inflation is 50%, right? Now, how do we build that trust internally? Property rights regime is what underlies any fundamental economic system. Do we as institutions, whatever level the institution is, from Bank of Ambazonia to our other subservient pseudo-governance bodies, are we building the trust of the people? If we don't build the trust of the people, if we don't capture the trust of the people, it doesn't matter what we call it, it doesn't matter what we do, it will not work. Somebody mentioned about South Sudan. Actually, and correcting the earlier speaker, South Sudan did have its own independent currency at independence. They never built the trust in the currency, so the currency failed. So this is a second iteration. The new currency they're introducing is a second iteration of a post-independent currency. Right now, the second level of trust is in external parties. Because yes, the currency is good for you to trade within your nation, but when you now start thinking about foreign exchange, and if we have time later, we'll talk about the nuances of monetary policy, especially when you think about independence and the need to control your foreign reserves and foreign exchange. You need international parties, other nations, citizens of other countries to also be able to trust that currency. That will not happen overnight. There's no question about that. And there are lots of steps that need to be taken pre-independence and post-independence to establish that, right? And some of them or most of them we cannot go about discussing here. So the answer is yes, it can be done. We definitely have the capabilities to do it. And it is not too soon for us to start working on the most fundamental ingredient for that, which is building trust in the people, having trust in Southern Cameroonians' ability to build institutions that respect fundamental rights, especially when it comes to economics, property rights.
Thank you
So
so much.
I hope that
Thank
was
you, Herman,
within the time limit.
for being very articulate and very direct. And I hope our discussant is making notes of all those important comments that you made. Now, I want to be upfront with all of us. We've been going for 2 hours now, and the attention span of most people on virtual platforms is very limited. So we know our experts here have a lot to share. Professor Amin has a lot in his notes. Herman came fully prepared, but guess what? We don't have all the time to be able to let you expound on all the ambitious project that we had today. But let's say this, let's consider this as a starting point of these conversations that will continue, and hopefully maybe not even in a public space like this, you know, being streamed out on social media networks. Maybe somebody and the Ambazonian leaders here present may probably see an opportunity to organize conclaves where experts meet in person and to talk deeper and work strategically to come out with these issues without sharing them all on social media. The point that Attorney Button continues to emphasize, whether it is any value in sharing all these conversations in the public at this time. So I want to leave the audience, our panelists, with one question, or maybe let them choose what they want to address from their notes. They came prepared with a lot of things to share, but I'll give them, each one of them, 5 minutes to probably just pick out the important or silent things that you think merits to be heard today. Especially as from going from the first part of the conversation, we are seeing that if if so far the government of Cameroon has maintained his idea of a one Cameroon agenda, one Cameroon, and when you talk about the Southern Cameroon crisis, they say, oh no, it's a one Cameroon. It's only something we have to discuss in a large dialogue or internal dialogue. They think it's a one Cameroon thing. And so despite our historical grievances and marginalization, they don't think it is enough reason to question that one Cameroon agenda. But what we've heard from this conference is that the failures of the CFA franc zone system, which is on the neck of Ambazonians right now, is also a more compelling reason why Ambazonians should fight with all their life to get independence, just because of the economic strangulation and slavery that system is imposing on Francophone Africa. That should be enough reason for anybody to agree with Ambazonians that you need to go. You need to be free. So what do you have on your notes, Professor Amin? I'll go to you first, that you think would align with the kind of lesson that we are hearing, and correct me if that's not the trend in what we've been hearing for 2 hours. If that's not what you think is coming out, feel free to correct me. Then sum up your arguments with us in 5 minutes before we bring out the questions in the chat room. And of course, the Ambazonian leaders who are present are also keen to make some closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Agua. I think one thing I would just say is let's just discuss questions in establishing a central bank. Establishing a central bank is a challenging process because of the importance of that institution. So the first question you ask, there are many questions you can ask, but the first one you ask is, what are the appointments? What are the appointments and voting rules with the procedures of governing board in monetary policy and other related issues? How do you appoint the members of the board? Second, how do you ensure trust and interests of the people, and people's interests manifested or should be reflected in the central bank policy. Third, the question of the independence of the central bank, independence from political pressure and institution. The central bank should supposed to be independent from political pressure. Like you see most of developed countries' central banks, like in the US system, is the central bank or Fed is completely independent from any political pressure. The chairperson and his board take decisions irrespective of what the pressure I get from the political institutions. Fourth, the mandate of central bank and the primary objectives of the monetary policy. The objectives include fundamental ones like sustaining an efficient and stable financial stable financial system with payment system. The price level stabilization with general economic activity, such as embedded in the situation of reducing poverty. But you see, we have noticed that in case of the CFA franc, the poverty level is very, very high relative to all other countries. But the central bank can actually do something about that in such a way that you reduce poverty. Remember, you look at the study that has been done in the Central Bank of India, actually impose some regulations that the banking sector, they must have branches in remote and impoverished area. And they did that. Building the initial items in the central bank balance sheet. When we talk about independence, the assets with capital and liability, they must ensure capitalization of this of the central bank. The bank must have enough capital to sustain, to stand any problems. 6, developing an analytical framework for policy and decision making. You have 2 levels of analysis: the levels of monetary aggregates and level of macro aggregates, which could also be in both internal and external. 7, how does the central bank keep up with the technological advance? We are talking about digital. How do you keep it up? You try to keep it in such a way that at least you have to, because of digitization and automation, integrate several resilience with decision-making process and into the system. Then the last point I would make here is, where do you print your money and your coins? Where do you print it? I know the most country, about 3/4 of African countries print their money outside. CFA franc print in France, but they print and send the money to the 2 regional banks to distribute. They're just like distributing.
Almost like a good.
Yes, they are not actually. But other countries actually sit down, negotiate, and place an order for their currency to be produced or printed or mint and send it back to them. So I leave it that.
Thank you so much, Professor Amin. Clearly, you've outlined an agenda for another conference. Actually, all the points you've mentioned there are enough to host a 3-day conference. You know, and thank you for your understanding, Professor Herman. What did you pick? And there are questions also in the chat room. We start answering them before we would bring in our esteemed Ambazonian leaders for comments, but we need to answer the questions in the chat room. Herman, you first have your 3 to 5 minutes of what you came prepared with to share, and then we connect with the questions that are in the chat room. Over to you.
Thank you, Professor Agbo. I think I will do that, but I would also take it with the stance of tackling some of the questions, because I think it dovetails nicely. I will give a little bit my perspective, and to kind of position my perspective, I'll give a bit my background, right? I think many people may or may not know. Yes, professionally, I'm in the business school. I do business strategy. But my education is in economics and international relations. So I look at things from mostly a behavioral point of view although still with a broader economic paradigm. So when we look at this conference and at this webinar, and when we look at the issues facing Southern Cameroon and Ambazonia, fundamentally, it is an economic issue. We will not be colonized by La République, and France will not be holding us hostage if we do not have valuable resources. If Southern Cameroon was just a deserted desert, we would have been free 100 years ago or more. So the issue of the currency is intricately interwoven with our freedom, because the currency is currently the method through which France holds or maintains its colonialization of the colonies. Now, I know there is the mantra that the enemy of my enemy can be my friend. It doesn't always work, but if you play and position your cards right, it can work for you in the broader momentum. To be independent, to have an independent currency, you are going to need a lot of friends to build that external recognition. But to get there, you're also going to need a lot of friends to push the colonizers to help let you go. And you need to align the motivations. So addressing one of our leaders there, I think Barrister Bob Harmony, as to the wisdom of having some of these discussions public. I really want to congratulate Bank of Ambazonia for setting this theme, tying the thought of our currency to CFA-EXIT, because that is one of those brilliant moves we have to do, and we have to do actually publicly. Because, permit me to just take a minute to tell you how this ties together with several things. Now we have a movement within the Sahel growing, centered around CFA-EXIT. And they become our very good friends. We have our colleague from Burkina Faso who spoke earlier. Many people know that we have many good friends and sympathizers. They're tied to the economic issue. Here within the US, I spent several days last week doing a white paper and briefings for some people, talking to the Congressional Black Caucus. Nothing should be secret about this. In fact, we should go about shouting this at the top of our lungs. In the US, in 3 weeks is going to be tax day. And most of us, as we're doing our taxes, we're wondering where our money is going. At the same time, I am looking at the news, and in France, they are protesting that the retirement age is being taken from 62 to 64. Most of us in the US are never going to retire, partly because of the taxes, by the way. And we don't see the connection. And let us take a minute when we explain to our American friends that you work, you know, we have the tax liberation day, which goes to April 1st, the number of days you work just to pay your taxes. How does this colonialization keep going on? African countries, Franc CFA countries are the poorest. They are always broke, but this regime can go on because, remember, the CFA was created the same day the Bretton Woods institutions were created, same day. France can hold the reserves of this country. By the way, something nobody talks about is those reserves, nobody knows the accounting of those reserves. So the actual amount of those reserves kind of is still fuzzy math. The economies of these countries may constantly get drained, but these countries are zombies. They don't die. Why don't they die? Just like we saw with Cameroon last week, every year they go to the IMF and the World Bank, and the IMF and the World Bank gives them something to keep them alive. Who puts money into the IMF and the World Bank? The US, for example, contributes 20% of IMF and World Bank capital. That is how those in the US, for example, my tax dollars go to ensure that while the Frenchman gets 2 months of vacation a year, I am negotiating with my wife which 2 weeks of vacation how we coordinate our 2 weeks of vacation. While I may have to work till I'm 80, the Frenchman is protesting on the street that they are taking retirement age from 62 to 64. This is how these are all tied together. We have to explain this. The franc CFA is the method through which France fleeces the African countries, and we in the US, Germany is the second highest contributor. Japan is contributing to the Bretton Woods institution. We prop up these zombie nations in Central Africa, in West Africa, such that they could subsidize the French welfare state. Until we start cutting that umbilical cord, and that umbilical cord can only be cut, can mostly be cut also from pressure outside. We start in the West. We constantly draw this connection between the CFA, the immigration problem in the Mediterranean, the immigration problem in the border. Why do we have mostly Africans now in Mexico trying to cross the border, not South Americans? It has everything to do with France. If we cannot draw that connection to the colonial currency, once we draw that connection, and we have to do so publicly, once we draw that connection, then all the machinations of the US government, the German government, the Italian government that don't want the immigrants coming to their shores become our friends.
Yes.
And that is how we use the economic policy to get our political freedom. Thank you. I hope that also answers the question.
Thank you, Professor Herman.